Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This podcast is sponsored by Ipono Maui and ED Care. Ipono Maui is led by internationally renowned expert on eating disorders, Dr. Anita Johnston. Located in a home-like oceanfront facility in beautiful Maui, Hawaii, Ipono offers residential, partial hospitalization, and intensive outpatient treatment for eating disorders. Visit iponomaui.com, spelled AIPONOMAUI, to learn more. ED Care has provided PHP, IOP, and outpatient treatment for all genders 18 and over since 2001. CAMSA, which stands for Connection, Acceptance, Mindfulness, Sense of Self, and Action, is ED Care's mindfulness-based treatment approach and is incorporated into each individualized treatment plan. Facilities are located in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City, and all treatment is supported by master's level clinicians or higher. ED Care offers 4 specialty tracks for binge eating disorder, elite athletes, substance use, and trauma. And the Connections House, an affordable supportive housing component, adds an extra layer of supervised support. Visit eatingdisorder.care or call 866-771-0861. Hey friends, today we're talking about diffusion as a skill for eating disorder recovery. Did just want to let you know this episode is mostly talking about and kind of doing a little lesson on what cognitive diffusion is. Then toward the end of that, there is a guided meditation to walk through as an activity with you. So if you're not in a place where you're available to do a guided meditation like you're driving, just save that and you can do that at a later time. Hey friends, thanks for being here for another episode. Real quick, I just wanted to ask for a favor, and I will ask in the next episode as well. But if you're enjoying the podcast and you find it helpful, it really helps me out if you leave a review on iTunes, specifically if you not only give a star rating, but also if you write a review. So the way to do that is to search for the show in the podcast app. Bring it up in the podcast app, not in the Listen Now section like it's set up. This is recorded in December of 2017, so it'll probably change in the future. But if you search for it in the podcast app, find the show's page, and then you scroll down a little bit, about halfway through that page, you'll find a section that says ratings and reviews. You can click a star rating right there. And then if you scroll a little bit further, there'll be a section that says write a review. And if you click on that, you can write out a review. It's really helpful to other people when they're searching for podcasts to figure out if this one is a good fit for them. And just think about back when you were trying to find a podcast that was going to work for you and going through and reading reviews and figuring out what you needed. It's really helpful if you write in specifically why this might be a good podcast and for different people and what they might be searching for. And again, I always really, really appreciate those. It helps the show up higher in search ratings. So even right now, if people search the exact name of this podcast, it's back buried behind a few podcasts. And that's because they produce more episodes than I do. So every time you give a review, it helps that out a little bit. So that's my main announcement. We are almost done with this season, which is just wild to me. I did want to clarify, I'm definitely coming back and doing season 4. I'll probably take about a couple months off, and I will probably relaunch during NEDA week here in the US, which is always the last full week of February. So stay tuned for that. As always, if you don't follow me on social media, do that. I'm at mostly on Facebook, facebook.com/Dr. Anderson author, and that's where I post most of the announcements related to the podcast. And then also, if you haven't joined the Facebook group yet, you absolutely can. You'll just search in the Facebook search bar for the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast, and it's a closed group. Request to join the group, and then I will approve you. So thanks so much for that. Today, we're talking about diffusion, or sometimes it's referred to as cognitive diffusion. I just say diffusion for short, really. Diffusion is a skill from ACT, from acceptance and commitment therapy. ACT focuses a lot on mindfulness, understanding your values, and then being able to take action that's in accordance with your values. So today we're talking about diffusion. So if we back up and we think a little bit about ourselves, one of the things that ACT teaches us, or really reminds us, is that our brains are thought-making machines. They're constantly creating thoughts. Some of our thoughts are helpful, some are not helpful, some are kind, some are unkind, some are pretty neutral, some are exciting, and some thoughts are eating disordered. So when we have an understanding that our brains, what they are meant to do and what they naturally do all the time is make thoughts, we can relax a little bit because we know that within that, not all of those thoughts are going to be true or kind or helpful. Now, if our baseline is to have a brain that's just constantly creating thoughts, when you also have an eating disorder, the eating disorder produces its own specific types of thoughts. And if you have an eating disorder or you're recovered from one, you're listening to that, you absolutely know that that's true. That it'll kind of piggyback on your brain's natural tendency to be making thoughts all the time, and it makes up thoughts that keep in line with its agenda. So if you think back all the way back to, I think it was episode 5 or 6 of this podcast where we talked about the eating disorder vicious cycle, and we talked about how the eating disorder sets you up with your thoughts, with your feelings, with your actions to continue to use eating disorder behaviors. That's its whole main goal. Your eating disorder just wants to keep going. And it does all kinds of things so that it stays relevant in your life. One of those things is that it uses your brain's natural habit of making thoughts all the time, and it makes the eating disorder thoughts. So your eating disorder is going to piggyback on your brain's pattern of making thoughts all the time. So if your brain is always making thoughts all the time, but you have this eating disorder, we can assume, we know that a lot of what your brain's going to be doing is making eating disordered thoughts. So let's talk about that. What types of thoughts do eating disorders like to produce? If you think about your own experience, what comes to mind? What types of thoughts does the eating disorder generally bring about? One of the things that comes to mind for me is obsessional thoughts, that they're not just a thought that's fleeting. They're thoughts that you're really attached to and that you repeat to yourself or you ruminate over, you get fixated on. Eating disorders love to have you fixate and ruminate and get stuck on things because it keeps you stuck in the eating disorder. It keeps you stuck thinking these unhelpful thoughts. Other common thoughts are all the different cognitive distortions we've talked about too. Things like catastrophic thoughts, like when you're catastrophizing, like your eating disorder is making you think worst case scenario. Other thoughts like really negative self-shaming thoughts. I'm bad, I've done these bad things, I'm so awful, my body is so awful, I'm horrible, I don't deserve good things, I deserve bad things, I deserve to be punished. All eating disorder kinds of thoughts, right? So your brain that's making all these thoughts all the time, because that's just what brains do unless they're sleeping, it has this eating disorder going on, and the eating disorder is jumping in there and it's taking up part of what your brain is doing of just making all these different thoughts. Eating disordered thoughts are usually very, very negative. A lot of the time they're focused on food, weight, they can be focused on body image. They can just be thoughts that are generally give you reason to be hard on yourself. And then also anything that sets you up to feel really emotionally upset, beat yourself up over, your eating disorder is totally going to use that because when you're emotionally upset and you're dysregulated, it makes behaviors sound really, really, really tempting. The bigger issue of why it's so important and why we're talking about diffusion today to detach from your eating disorders thoughts is because when we think thoughts over and over and over again, the same sorts of thoughts, like if you think the thought, I'm a loser, and you think that and you repeat it and you nourish that thought and it grows in connection and strength, what that thought turns into is a belief. And a belief is a deeply rooted thought about how things work. And your eating disorder is all about like creating a whole bunch of negative beliefs because it's going to fuel you for using behaviors. It's going to fuel all that shame beating yourself up, binging, purging, restricting, over exercising, all that stuff. It's going to keep all of that going. So if you keep thinking all those thoughts over and over and over again, they become belief. After belief, thoughts that we keep repeating over and over and over again, they become part of our identity. Many of my clients have told me, and I could tell you from my personal experience, that when you're thinking eating disorder thoughts, most of the day or all day, every day that you're experiencing that, it's really hard to tell what is you and what is the eating disorder. And that's part of what we're trying to work on today, is separating from those eating disorder thoughts. So when we don't separate from eating disorder thoughts, our identity becomes about the eating disorder, because our thoughts have become about the eating disorder and beliefs have become about the eating disorder too. And the thing is, you absolutely can detach from that. It's totally doable. It just takes a lot of practice. And there is a person in there that does not have an eating disorder. You were not born with this. It is not who you are. And the thoughts that it produces are kind of predictable. We can find a lot of patterns amongst a lot of different kinds of people of what are eating disorder thoughts. If you're obsessing about food and you're beating yourself up over it, probably an eating disorder thought. So we want to try to pull apart what are the eating disorder thoughts and what are just our thoughts. When we're cognitively fused to something, it means that we are stuck next to it. Let's talk about this thought, I'm a loser. So if I'm thinking I'm a loser and it feels true, I've thought that thought a bunch of times, I am fused with it. I am stuck to it. It feels true. When we are fused with thoughts, they feel like a truth. Now, what diffusion does, cognitive diffusion, is it's detaching from those thoughts. So the goal of cognitive diffusion is to try to get us to see thoughts for what they are, which is that they're just thoughts. And what do brains do? They just make thoughts. They make a bunch of thoughts. They make thoughts all day long, every day. So when we're separating and we think, I'm a loser, the first step in diffusion is creating a little bit more distance. So this requires us to have a little bit of mindfulness. We've talked about mindfulness on this podcast before, and I'm sure a bunch of you are already familiar with it. But if we take more of an observing perspective, and we're trying not to just sit in it, in the throes of it. So if we take a step back and we say, I'm a loser, diffusion would have you practice saying, I'm having the thought that I'm a loser. You see the difference? I'm a loser, believing it, being stuck to that thought, having it feel true with a capital T, versus thinking I'm a loser and then noticing I'm having the thought that I'm a loser. So diffusion is this practice of again and again and again, trying to see thoughts for what they are. And kind of like we talked about in the mindfulness episode, or you've probably talked about or know about from mindfulness practice in general, we can practice and learn to see our thoughts as this kind of flowing stream, that they're just going to continue to come. Thoughts come, thoughts go. And even if they're eating disorder thoughts and they're really emotionally loaded and they have a bunch of charge to them, when we take a step back and we decide, okay, I'm going to try to diffuse from this thought, I'm going to let myself know it's just a thought, it helps us to not believe it to be so true. It creates a lot of distance. And the way that you do that is by noticing the thoughts as they come up. Cognitive fusion happens in eating disorders all the time. Your eating disorder wants you to be buddy-buddy with all these thoughts. It wants you to think that you're terrible. It wants you to think that you can't handle emotion. It wants you to think that you can't get through life without this eating disorder. It wants you to also think that life is easier with an eating disorder and that it's really helpful. All of those things are just thoughts. And as they're coming up, if you can see them as like just kind of a stream of ideas that are coming up without hooking into them, it's going to help you to have so much more distance and so much more peace. Now, Diffusion is particularly helpful for thoughts that maybe have become beliefs, or thoughts that feel extremely negative, or thoughts that are drawing a really negative conclusion. So one of the things I always hear is clients who will say, I can't recover, I can't do this. Now, diffusion might be a really helpful strategy here. If we take that thought, I can't recover, I can't do this, and we say, all right, this is the thought that's coming up. I'm choosing to defuse from that. I'm not sure that that's true or not. I don't want to be fused to a thought that says I can't recover. I'm going to take a step back. So we're going to say, I notice I'm having the thought that I can't recover. And that's really all you have to do, is just put that extra little step in there. Diffusion is all about challenging the assumption that our thoughts are true. Some thoughts are true. Some thoughts do turn into beliefs, but we have a lot more power in picking those thoughts than our eating disorder would have us believe. And that's again because the eating disorder really just wants to stay relevant and keep itself going and hang out with you forever and ever. But if you're trying to kick it out of your life, diffusion is really, really, really helpful. All you have to do is kind of take this extra step back and mindfully observe, I'm having the thought. I am noticing this thought. This thought is popping up. And the more you do that, and the more you practice it, the easier it becomes, just like with everything else. So I'm going to actually walk you through a diffusion meditation right now. So if you're driving, don't do this. Save this until later. Like only do this if you're in a place where it's safe to take a second to do a guided meditation and to be able to concentrate fully. So again, don't do this if you're driving or something like that. The first thing I want for you to do in this meditation is I want for you to relax, get seated comfortably, notice any tension in your body, just let your muscles relax. Let yourself let that go. If it's helpful for you to close your eyes or lower your gaze so that you're staring just at the floor in front of you or your toes on the floor, do that. And take a deep breath. And as you're ready, starting to draw more awareness to your thoughts. Just noticing, without judgment, the thoughts that are coming through your mind. Maybe you're thinking about what you need to do, things you're struggling with. Maybe you're just getting off track. It's okay, just bringing yourself back to the present moment. Just practicing observing these thoughts. Practicing seeing those thoughts as thoughts coming up, going by on a stream. Not feeling temptation to get lost in any of them, to explore them too deeply, to get emotionally hooked on them. Just letting them roll by. Now I want for you to let some eating disorder thoughts come up. Same thing, just noticing the thoughts as they're popping up, observing them as thoughts that are floating by, just as thoughts. And I want for you to notice what exactly is on the thought. Maybe there are a few sentences your eating disorder is telling you. Maybe it's that you can't recover. Maybe it's that things are hopeless. Maybe it's that you shouldn't eat this or that. Whatever it is, noticing if there are a few sort of sentences the eating disorder is saying in this moment. And I want for you to picture those thoughts getting recorded onto a CD or a digital file, cassette, whatever you pick. And I want for you to picture some sort of music player, however you like. Maybe it's your computer. Maybe it's a stereo. Maybe it's an old school boombox. Whatever you like. I need to picture some sort of recording music player. And visualize yourself taking that recording and putting it in the music player. Maybe queuing this up on your computer to play. This eating disorder thoughts track. Picture yourself pushing play. Hearing the eating disorder thoughts that you've recorded playing back to you. Observing what it's like for you to hear them played back. It might sound funny played at a distance. Now we're going to experiment without judgment. Notice what it's like if you turn the volume up on the eating disorder thoughts. Turn it up a little louder. What are those thoughts like when they're really loud? Noticing what you feel when the eating disorder thoughts are really loud. It's stressful, maybe sad, maybe you feel angry, maybe they feel truer, like they could pull you in more when they're loud. And I'd like for you, in your mind's eye, to picture yourself doing just the opposite now. I'd like for you to turn the volume down, lower than the initial volume that you had it. To put the volume on low. Same eating disorder thoughts, but now they're not that much louder than a whisper. Notice how you feel when they're lower, when the volume is low. And in your mind's eye, I'd like for you to take a step backward from the music player. Picture yourself stepping back. And take another step back, even farther away from the thoughts. And again and again. You could even picture yourself putting the music player in the corner of the room and walking away. And noticing how you feel now when they're lower. Maybe you can't even hear them at all. And as you're ready, I want you to bring yourself back to the present moment that you're in. Not rushing yourself, but getting yourself ready to come back. Maybe slowly starting to let some of that light seep through your eyelids. Getting ready to open your eyes. And when you're ready, opening your eyes. How do you feel? So this is the point of diffusion. The eating disorder thoughts that you selected for that meditation are not any different than when you first recorded them versus at the end of the meditation. The thoughts were still there, but the way that you interacted with them was different. And that can be a really, really helpful technique in recovery. Because sometimes, even though ultimately we're working on changing those thoughts, sometimes they are just raging. And all we can do is kind of put them on a recorder, turn the volume down, set that puppy down in the corner of a room, and back up. And that's a totally acceptable strategy. So, especially if you've been struggling with feeling like, I'm so stuck, I cannot change my beliefs, all of these things feel so true. this is a different angle for you to look at it from. That maybe right now you don't have to even change those thoughts. And a lot of people actually don't think that you need to change thoughts overall. It's just how I personally approach it. But that if you can even change how you interact with those thoughts instead, if you can turn the volume down, if you can back away from those thoughts for even a minute and you practice doing that consistently, it's going to change how you feel overall. So when those thoughts are really, the volume is turned up, if you can pause and say to yourself, wow, my eating disorder thoughts are so loud right now. I'm going to do my meditation where I picture putting them on a recording, playing that recording back and turning the volume down. It could really help you get some space from them. So I hope you found this helpful. I will see you for the final episode of Season 3. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.